The Endangered Species Act tried to shield rare wildlife from extinction, yet it gave some landowners a quiet reason to erase habitat before regulators could notice. This is Unintended Consequences, Episode 89. In the pine forests of eastern North Carolina during the early 1990s, timber companies began cutting mature longleaf pines at a noticeably faster pace near sites where red-cockaded woodpeckers might nest. The birds had been listed as endangered since 1970. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 imposed strict limits on any land where they appeared. Landowners who once left older trees standing now treated those stands as a liability that could trigger federal oversight, development halts, or costly surveys. The law had been written to prevent the next bald eagle-style loss. Instead, it created an incentive to remove the very conditions a listed species would need. What looked like ordinary harvest timing on paper was often a calculated step to keep the birds from claiming a site that would then fall under permanent restriction. Congress passed the Endangered Species Act on December 28, 1973, with broad bipartisan support and President Nixon's signature. Lawmakers had watched the near extinction of the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, and the whooping crane. Those species declines traced directly to habitat loss, DDT, and unregulated hunting. The statute made it illegal to take a listed animal. Courts later interpreted that term to include significant habitat modification on private land. At the time, the dominant view in Washington held that uniform federal prohibitions would stop incremental destruction before species crossed the threshold of recovery. Sponsors believed the costs would fall mainly on large development projects and public lands, not on ordinary private owners who might still manage their property as before. They reasoned that once a species reached the brink, the only reliable safeguard was to make any further harm legally costly, regardless of who owned the ground. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began listing species and designating critical habitat through the late 1970s and 1980s. Early enforcement focused on high-profile cases such as the snail darter and the northern spotted owl. Those cases produced court-ordered logging pauses in the Pacific Northwest. Proponents pointed to the law's role in halting the bald eagle's decline and supporting the gray whale's rebound. Both species later allowed delisting. Skeptics, including some rural landowners and state wildlife agencies, warned that the Act's broad "take" language would discourage voluntary habitat maintenance once a species appeared on a property. Those warnings remained largely theoretical until economists began examining timber harvest records in the Southeast. The service's early emphasis on enforcement through litigation and injunctions left little room for negotiated arrangements that might have rewarded landowners for keeping older stands intact. By the mid-1990s, researchers examining North Carolina pine plantations found that stands old enough to host red-cockaded woodpeckers were being harvested earlier than comparable stands farther away. A study by economists at North Carolina State University and Resources for the Future documented accelerated cutting within a few miles of known colonies. The pattern was consistent with owners trying to eliminate nesting cavities before federal agents could confirm occupancy. The pattern became known colloquially among some landowners as shoot, shovel, and shut up. Because the act penalized the presence of the bird rather than the absence of its habitat, the rational response for a timber owner facing potential restrictions was to shorten rotation cycles or convert land to other uses before surveys occurred. A landowner could calculate that losing several years of growth on a stand was cheaper than facing a permanent ban on harvest or the expense of moving operations elsewhere. Second-order effects followed. Fewer older pines meant less habitat overall. That in turn made future listings more likely on remaining parcels and increased enforcement costs for the Fish and Wildlife Service. The dynamic also chilled cooperation. Landowners stopped reporting sightings or allowing biologists on their land. This reduced the data available for recovery planning. The same statute that produced recoveries for other species simultaneously created the preemptive incentive on private timberland where most red-cockaded woodpecker habitat existed. The result was not open defiance, but quiet, anticipatory action that removed the conditions the law had hoped to protect. In 1995, the Fish and Wildlife Service introduced safe harbor agreements. The program was first piloted with a North Carolina landowner who agreed to manage pines for red-cockaded woodpeckers in exchange for assurances that future regulatory burdens would not increase if the population grew. The agreements flipped the incentive. Landowners who voluntarily improved habitat received legal certainty rather than new restrictions. By 2023, more than 600 agreements covered over 4 million acres nationwide. The original act remained in force and continued to drive recoveries for species such as the bald eagle, delisted in 2007, and the gray whale, delisted in 1994. Yet the preemptive clearing problem has not disappeared entirely on lands where safe harbor coverage is absent. The policy adjustment showed that the core statute could be retained while its incentive structure was locally realigned. Later expansions of the safe harbor model to other species demonstrated that the same principle could be applied without rewriting the underlying prohibitions. Incentive structures that punish the discovery of a problem rather than its absence will reliably produce concealment or preemption. Complex statutes that apply uniform prohibitions across millions of private parcels create strong local motives to act before regulators arrive. Safe harbor agreements illustrate that adding voluntary, reward-based options can reduce those motives without repealing the underlying protection. When designing rules that touch dispersed private decisions, the practical question is not only whether the rule bans the harm, it is also whether the rule rewards the stewardship that prevents the harm from arising in the first place. The same tension appears whenever regulation hinges on detection rather than on measurable improvement of the underlying condition. Consider any modern permitting process that triggers new obligations the moment a protected feature is documented on private land. What behavior does that detection threshold actually encourage among owners who must decide whether to report what they find? That's unintended consequences for today. If this episode gave you something to think about, share it with a friend who'd appreciate the story. Subscribe wherever you listen, and we'll be back tomorrow with another case. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network. Links in the show notes. Quick tip from the network. Try Fascinating Frontiers next, the most fascinating news from space and science. Every NARA Network show is free at naranetwork.com. And on the website, every episode's visuals live in our free image gallery at naranetwork.com gallery. Royalty-free under Creative Commons. Download with attribution. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.